welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really diving deep into grief.
Grief, yeah, it's something we all experience at some point.
Unfortunately, yeah. And you brought us chapter 8, Ministering to Those Experiencing Grief, from My Turn to Care.
By Dr. Warwick Cooper.
Right.
I thought this is a good one to discuss.
Yeah. Let's unpack Dr. Cooper's insights on supporting people who are grieving and see what new perspectives we might find.
Yeah, for sure. This chapter really resonated with me because it challenges a lot of, I guess, the typical ways we think about grief.
Okay.
It goes beyond just kind of acknowledging sadness, which we all know is a part of it.
Right.
But it digs into how complex grief can be.
Okay, so let's unpack that complexity. So the chapter starts by saying that grief isn't just sadness.
Right.
I mean, we all know that at some level, right?
Yep.
But then it gets into fear, anger, even physical symptoms. And then it mentions C.S. Lewis, and he describes grief as feeling mildly drunk or concussed.
Yeah, mildly drunk or concussed. I mean, what an image.
Yeah.
I think that really highlights how profoundly grief can affect us.
Right.
It's not just an emotional experience. It impacts the way we think, too. And I think that's what Lewis is getting at with that description.
Wow. I never thought about it like that.
Yeah, it's like grief can kind of throw you off balance mentally.
Right. It makes sense because when I've been in deep grief, it is really hard to focus. It's like my brain is just not working right. So I wonder if that's what Lewis was getting at.
Yeah, I think so. He's talking about that feeling of disorientation, right?
Yeah.
You know, like grief has this power to derail your thought processes. And Dr. Cooper, he digs into the cognitive effects of grief in this chapter, like difficulty concentrating, foggy memory. Even simple decisions can feel impossible. Like, how am I supposed to decide what to eat for dinner? It's just, grief just demands so much mental and emotional energy that other cognitive functions really do take a back seat.
That's insightful. It's not just that you're sad, which is already a lot.
Right, exactly.
Your whole system is thrown off. And it makes me think about Lois and Taylor.
Oh, right.
The couple in the book who are dealing with the loss of Taylor's sibling. And their story really highlights how differently people cope.
Yeah, it does. Because, Lois, she buries herself in work. It's almost like she's trying to outrun the pain.
To avoid it.
Yeah, exactly. Avoid it at all costs. But then you have Taylor, who completely isolates himself, turns to substances.
Right. So you have two totally opposite reactions.
Yeah, they're polar opposites.
So the same loss.
And it just goes to show there's no right way to grieve.
No.
Everybody handles it differently.
Right. And neither one of those ways is great, right?
Well, and that's the thing.
Like they both have consequences. It's almost like they each just grabbed onto whatever coping mechanism felt familiar in the moment.
Yeah.
Even if it wasn't particularly healthy.
Right.
I can see myself in both of them, to be honest. Sometimes I just want to completely distract myself.
Sure.
And then other times all I want to do is like hide from the world.
Yeah.
Do you think that's personality or is that just the nature of the loss?
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
And I think researchers are still trying to figure that out.
Okay.
Like, what's nature versus nurture when it comes to grief?
Right.
There's definitely a link between our personality, like, are we introverted or extroverted? How do we typically handle stress?
Yeah.
And those tendencies, they probably influence how we grieve.
Yeah.
But, we can't discount the impact of the loss itself, right?
Right.
The relationship you have with the person who died, the circumstances of their death.
Right.
All of those factors contribute to, how deeply you feel the loss.
Yeah.
And how you process it.
So layered.
It really is.
And speaking of different approaches to grief, the book also talks about the 5 stages of grief model.
Yes.
Which, let's be honest, we've all heard of, right?
Right.
Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But what I appreciate about Dr. Cooper is that he doesn't present those 5 stages as a checklist.
Exactly. It's not a checklist.
Which I think a lot of people do.
Yeah. And, while the Kübler-Ross model, as it's known, it's been incredibly influential.
Right, for sure.
I think it's important to emphasize, and what this chapter does a really good job of, is emphasizing that it's not a one-size-fits-all roadmap for grief.
Yeah, it's not like a step-by-step process. It's more like a potential range of emotions you might feel.
Exactly.
But not everybody feels them all or feels them in that order.
Right, exactly. And I love the story that Dr. Cooper tells to illustrate this point.
Oh, yeah.
He talks about this woman battling cancer, and she confided in him that she felt really guilty about being angry at God.
Right.
Because she felt like she should be at peace, accepting her fate.
Yeah.
But Dr. Cooper, he gently challenged that.
Right. He's like, that doesn't sound quite right.
And he reminded her that, even King David in the Psalms, he expressed anger towards God.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think by sharing that, he essentially gave her permission to feel the full spectrum of her emotions without judgment,
Right.
to be angry.
Yeah, that's such a critical reminder because so often when we're grieving, there's this pressure to move on quickly, right? Like,
Right.
you've grieved enough,
Yeah.
get over it.
Back to normal.
Back to normal. Yeah, back to normal. But that just feels so inauthentic.
Right.
Because, grief makes people uncomfortable, so we think that we're supposed to have it all together by a certain point. Like, you get 2 weeks or a month.
Right.
And then you should be over it, whatever that means.
It's so true. And, that pressure to move on can be so isolating.
Oh, yeah.
It just completely invalidates what the person's going through.
Right.
And, like Dr. Cooper points out, that pressure to return to normal can actually be harmful to the healing process.
Absolutely.
Because instead of really letting yourself grieve and process those emotions,
Yeah.
you end up pushing them down.
Right, like sweeping them under the rug.
Exactly. And then they just come out in other ways later on.
Right. Yeah, and that brings us to what Dr. Cooper calls the importance of allowing oneself to grieve fully.
Yes.
Which, it sounds obvious, but how often do we really let ourselves do that?
That's the thing, right? We don't give ourselves permission
No.
to just feel what we need to feel.
Especially in this day and age. It's like, you're supposed to be fine.
Right. Exactly.
Bounce back, be resilient.
Yeah, be strong.
And I've definitely been guilty of that myself, like telling myself to just get over it.
Sure.
Buck up, be strong, But it's almost like we're conditioned to avoid those difficult feelings, even though, they're a natural part of life.
They are. They're part of the human experience.
Yeah.
And it's not about wallowing in sadness or, just staying stuck in that place of pain, but it's about acknowledging those feelings are there.
Right.
Giving them space to exist, to breathe.
Totally.
And Dr. Cooper, he emphasizes that true healing, it requires you to face your grief, not try to run from it.
That makes sense. But how do we actually do that? Like, how do you support someone, or even yourself, in a way that creates that safe space for grief to just happen?
Well, Dr. Cooper, he talks about the importance of active listening.
Okay.
Which, might sound basic,
Right.
but it's really important.
Yeah.
It's about being fully present with the person who's grieving.
Right. Like, really being there with them in their pain without trying to fix it.
Exactly. And without judging what they're feeling or thinking.
Right. Just holding that space for them.
Yes. And what I found interesting is that he points out that this looks different for different people.
Of course. Yeah.
Some people might want to talk about their grief constantly.
Right.
Others might just want quiet company.
Right. Just to have someone there.
Exactly. So it's about being sensitive to their individual needs and what feels right for them in that moment.
I know for me, when I'm grieving, the last thing I want is advice.
Right.
Just be present with me.
Yeah.
Don't try to tell me what to do.
Yeah, don't try to fix it.
Right, exactly.
Because you can't fix grief.
And the book also talks about the importance of offering practical support, which I think can be overlooked sometimes.
Yes, because it's so easy to say, let me know if you need anything.
Right, which feels meaningless in the moment.
It's overwhelming. Like, what am I supposed to need?
Right, exactly.
Dr. Cooper suggests offering specific help instead.
Okay, yeah. What does that sound like?
Like, instead of anything, it's, can I bring you dinner next Tuesday? Or, how about I mow your lawn this week?
Right, so tangible, helpful things.
Exactly. It takes the pressure off the person who's grieving to even have to think about those things.
Right, because they're dealing with so much already.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's about lightening their load, showing up in a way that actually makes a difference.
It's the difference between saying, I'm here for you, and actually showing up, right?
Yes. Actions speak louder than words, always.
Right.
And it's not just a one-time thing either.
Right, this isn't just for the week after the funeral.
Exactly. Dr. Cooper emphasizes the importance of following up, checking in with the person in the weeks and months that follow the loss.
Because, as we said, grief doesn't have a timeline.
It doesn't just disappear.
Life goes on.
It does.
And you have moments, I think, where those feelings just hit you out of nowhere.
Absolutely.
So it's important to, just continue to show up for people.
Be a steady presence, a source of comfort and support over the long haul.
Yeah. And that means respecting their process, which I think is another important point from this chapter.
It is, and it can be tough because sometimes someone's grieving process might look really different from our own.
Oh, absolutely.
And we might have these ideas about what normal grieving looks like.
Right.
But the reality is, there is no one right way to grieve.
No, everybody's different.
We have to resist the urge to impose our own timelines or expectations on other people.
Oh, we've all heard those comparisons. Oh, he seems like he's doing so much better. Or, she should really be back to her old self by now. It's like we're all judging each other's groove.
And those comparisons, they're not helpful at all.
No.
And they can be so hurtful.
Absolutely.
Everyone grieves at their own pace, and what really matters is that they have the space and support to do that without judgment.
That's so key.
And Dr. Cooper also talks about being mindful of cultural and religious differences.
Oh, that's a great point.
Because what might be comforting to one person
Right.
might be totally different for someone else based on their background and beliefs.
Of course, yeah. Like in some cultures, wailing and open displays of grief are encouraged.
Right.
And in other cultures, it's much more subdued.
Exactly.
So being sensitive to those differences can really help us support people in a way that feels authentic.
And respectful.
Yeah, and it's about meeting people where they are in that moment, not where we think they should be.
Absolutely. And sometimes that means recognizing that someone might need more support than we can offer, and that's okay.
Right.
Dr. Cooper talks about how encouraging someone to seek professional help, it's not a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of strength and self-awareness.
It takes a lot of strength to say, hey, I need help. And I think there's still a stigma around therapy or counseling for some people, but grief can be so incredibly isolating. Having that professional support can really make a world of difference.
It really can.
And it's not about fixing grief because, as we've been saying, you can't fix it.
Right.
But it's about having someone to help you work through it, someone with the tools and the training to guide you through those really tough emotions.
Exactly. And it's not just about processing the emotional stuff either.
Right.
Remember how we talked about those cognitive impacts of grief?
Yeah.
Difficulty concentrating, feeling disoriented, being forgetful. Those are all normal responses to loss. They're real.
It's like your brain is trying to, I don't know, adjust to this new reality without that person in it. And that takes time. And it can show up in weird ways, too. I remember after my grandmother passed away, I kept misplacing things, forgetting appointments, just silly things. But it was like my brain was fried.
Yeah, it's like grief takes up so much space in your brain that other things just kind of fall by the wayside. And Dr. Cooper really emphasizes the importance of patience, both with ourselves and with others who are grieving. It takes time for those cognitive functions to come back online, so to speak.
It's a process. So as we wrap up our deep dive into this chapter on grief, what are some of the key things you hope our listeners take away from this conversation? What really stuck with you?
You know, for me, it's that shift in perspective that Dr. Cooper encourages. Seeing grief not as something to get over, but as a journey, and approaching that journey with compassion, both for ourselves and for the people around us.
Instead of asking, how do we fix this? We should be asking, how do we hold space for this?
Yes, exactly. And letting go of that need to judge, to impose timelines, to have expectations.
Grief is messy.
It is.
And it's different for everyone, and that's okay. Well, if this deep dive has sparked some new insights for you, maybe even brought up some personal reflections, we encourage you to explore those further. Write them down, talk to someone you trust, or maybe even revisit the book. My Turn to Care has some excellent resources. Grief can be a really difficult journey, but you don't have to go through it alone. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into understanding and supporting ourselves and each other through grief.